The dust of Redemption Creek, Montana, held more secrets than gold. It clung to every boot, settled in every weary heart, and on a blistering August afternoon, in 1885, it swirled with a particularly cruel kind of anticipation. The 3:15 train was due, carrying a woman sight, unseen, a mail-order bride for Colton Harding, a man known more for his sprawling ranch than his sparse words. The townsfolk gathered not for a celebration, but for a spectacle. They whispered behind gloved hands and tilted hats, their curiosity sharpened to a razor's edge. They expected a demure flower from the east. What they got was an earthquake, in a calico dress, a woman who would test the very foundations of their prejudice and unearth a love as fierce and untamed as the land itself. The whistle of the locomotive was a long, mournful cry that cut through the oppressive heat of the afternoon. On the platform of the Redemption Creek station, Colton Harding shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the sweat beading on his brow, having little to do with the sun beating down on his worn felt hat. He was a man carved from the Montana landscape, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a silence that often unnerved those who didn't know him. At 32, he commanded one of the largest ranches in the territory, the Diamond H, yet he stood on that splintered plank platform, feeling as green as a boy on his first cattle drive. He tugged at the collar of his shirt, the cleanest one he owned. The advertisement he'd placed in the matrimonial monitor 6 months ago felt like a lifetime away, a desperate act committed in the lonely quiet of a winter night. Hard-working rancher 32 solvent, and of good character, seeks a wife of practical means and honest heart to share a life in the Montana territory. Object matrimony. He'd included a photograph, a stiff and formal portrait, where he looked more like he was facing a firing squad than a camera. The response had come from a Miss Genevieve Peterson of Athens, Ohio. Her letter was brief, her penmanship clear and strong. She wrote of a family farm lost to blight, and her desire for a new start, a partnership built on mutual respect and hard work. Her words were unadorned and direct, and he'd found himself admiring their frankness. He'd sent the train fare and a small sum for her travels, and now the day of reckoning was here. The screech of iron wheels on steel rails grew deafening as the train shuddered to a halt, releasing a great sigh of steam. Doors opened, and passengers began to disembark, salesmen in dusty suits, families with weary children, a handful of prospectors with hope-filled eyes. Colton scanned the faces, searching for the small, demure woman he'd pictured, someone who might soften the hard edges of his life. Then she appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and Colton's carefully constructed image shattered. Genevieve Peterson was not small. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, with the kind of broad, sturdy frame that spoke of a life of labor, not leisure. Her shoulders under the simple brown traveling dress were wide. Her hands gripping a worn carpet bag were capable and strong, not delicate and pale. Her face, framed by thick auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, was handsome rather than pretty, with a square jaw, a straight nose and wide-set eyes, the color of moss after a rain. She paused at the top of the steps, her gaze sweeping over the dusty town with an unnerving stillness and assessment. She didn't look lost or frightened. She looked like she was measuring the place up. A wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers gathered near the station. Colton heard it distinctly, a venomous little hiss that slithered through the air. "Good heavens, Beatrice!" A woman's voice, sharp and nasal, cut through the noise. "He's ordered himself a draft horse, not a wife." Colton's jaw tightened. He recognized the voice of Henrietta Price, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her bony elbows. The Beatrice she spoke to was Mrs. Beatrice Higgins, the wife of the general store proprietor, and the self-appointed queen of Redemption Creek's social circle. Beatrice saw a woman built like a sparrow, who fancied herself a bird of paradise, let out a delicate, cruel titter behind her fan. "Hush now, Henrietta. Perhaps Mr. Harding needs help ploughing his fields." The laughter, though muffled, was unmistakable. Colton felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. He had never cared a whit for the town's gossip, but to have it directed at this woman, a stranger he had brought here, felt like a personal failing. He squared his shoulders and strode forward, his boots sounding a definitive thud on the platform. Genevieve's eyes found his, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in their green depths, not fear, but a weary apprehension, the look of someone who had faced this kind of judgment before. He stopped before her as she descended the final step. "Miss Peterson," he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mr. Harding," she replied. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, a calm alto, with no hint of fragility. She didn't offer her hand, but gave a slight, formal nod. "It is a long journey." It is he agreed, the inadequacy of his words hanging in the air. He reached for her bag. "Allow me." His fingers brushed against hers as he took the handle, and he was struck by the calluses on her palm. These were not the hands of a lady of leisure. He turned to face the gawking crowd, his stormy eyes flashing a warning. Beatrice Higgins and her flock had the decency to look away, busying themselves with feigned conversations. "The wagon is over here," Colton said, gesturing with his head. The ranch is a few hours out. The ride to the Diamond H was a study in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels and the clop of the horses' hooves were the only constants. The landscape unfurled around them, a vast expanse of rolling grasslands, distant purple mountains, and a sky so big it felt like it could swallow a man whole. Colton, a man comfortable with silence, found this one different. It was heavy with things unsaid, with the mockery on the platform and the uncertainty of their future. Finally, it was Genevieve who spoke, her voice even and measured. "Your letter mentioned you have over 500 head of cattle." Colton was startled by the practicality of the question. Closer to 600 now after the spring calves. Good grazing land. "The best in this valley," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "The creek on my property runs year-round. It's the lifeblood of the place. Water is everything," she agreed, nodding. She looked out at the land, not as a passenger, but as a surveyor. "We lost our farm in Ohio to 2 seasons of drought, followed by a flood. The land gives, and the land takes." There was no self-pity in her tone, only a statement of fact. He found himself relaxing slightly. This was a language he understood, not the flowery nonsense of poetry, or the brittle chatter of town socials, but the hard, unforgiving reality of the land. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and he meant it. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Sorrow doesn't plant the next crop, Mr. Harding." "Colton," he corrected her gently. "My name is Colton." "Genevieve," she replied, "though most call me Jenny." The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink when they finally crested a rise, and the Diamond H came into view. It wasn't a grand sight. The ranch house was a sturdy single-story structure made of timber and stone, flanked by a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse for the hands. It was a place of work, solid and unpretentious, a mirror of the man who owned it. As they pulled into the yard, an older man with a wiry frame and a face like a road map of his 60-plus years emerged from the barn. This was Gus O'Malley, Colton's foreman, and the closest thing he had to a father, since his own had passed a decade prior. Gus wiped his hands on a rag, his shrewd blue eyes taking in the scene, Colton on the wagon seat, and the tall woman beside him. He walked over as Colton reined in the horses. Boss Gus said, his gaze lingering on Jenny for a moment. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a quiet curiosity. "Gus, this is Miss Genevieve Peterson," Colton said, climbing down from the wagon. "Jenny, this is my foreman, Gus O'Malley." Colton turned and offered his hands to help her down. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hands in his. He easily swung her to the ground, and for that brief moment he was acutely aware of her solidity, her sheer physical presence. She was no fragile thing to be sheltered from the world. She felt rooted to the earth. Jenny looked at the foreman and gave him the same direct nod she had given Colton. "Mr. O'Malley." Gus touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the Diamond Age." His eyes met Colton's over her head, and in them Colton saw not judgment, but a simple, straightforward acceptance. For the first time that day, a knot of tension in Colton's chest began to loosen. "I'll show you inside," Colton said to Jenny. "I've had a room prepared." He led her toward the house he had built with his own hands. The front door opened into a large main room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The furniture was simple, masculine, and well-worn. It was clean, but lacked any touch of softness or artistry. It was a house, not a home. Jenny stood in the center of the room, her worn bag still in her hand, and took it all in. She didn't comment on the sparse decor or the lack of curtains on the windows. Her gaze was practical assessing. "The kitchen is through here," Colton said, leading her toward the back. "Your room is this one." He opened a door to a small, plain room containing a simple iron bedstead with a handmade quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small wooden wardrobe. It was Spartan, but it was clean. "It's fine," she said, her eyes on the quilt. It was a simple 9-patch pattern, the colors muted. "My mother made that," Colton said quietly, before she passed. Jenny reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers tracing one of the seams. It was the first gesture of softness he had seen from her. When she looked back at him, the weary apprehension in her eyes had been replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Colton," she said, using his first name again. "I will treat it with care." That night, after a simple supper of beef stew and biscuits that they ate in near total silence, Colton sat on his porch, staring into the darkness. The sounds of the ranch, the low nickering of a horse, the distant call of a coyote were a familiar comfort. But tonight, they were different. They were the backdrop to a new reality. The presence of the woman sleeping in the room down the hall changed the very air of the place. He thought of the whispers at the station, the cruel, dismissive laughter. He had brought her here to this harsh land and its even harsher judgments. He had done it out of loneliness, out of a practical need for a partner. But looking at her, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes and the uncomplaining set of her jaw, he felt a flicker of something more. It wasn't pity. It was a nascent, unwilling respect. Genevieve Peterson was not what he had expected. She was more. The question that echoed in the lonely Montana night was whether he was man enough to deserve her. The sun had barely kissed the peaks of the distant mountains when Colton emerged from his room the next morning. The smell of coffee, rich and strong, and frying bacon already filled the main room. He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen, surprised. Jenny stood at the big cast-iron stove, her back to him. She had found an apron somewhere and tied it around her waist. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing strong, capable forearms. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with a kitchen. The fire was lit, the coffee was percolating, and a pan of bacon sizzled invitingly. She hadn't waited to be told. She had simply seen a need and filled it. "Good morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. She turned a wooden spoon in her hand. Her hair was again pulled back in its severe bun, but a few stray auburn wisps had escaped to frame her face. Morning. Coffee's ready. Biscuits will be out in a minute. He poured himself a mug of coffee. It was better than the sludge he usually made. He sat at the kitchen table watching her. She wasn't performing for him. She was simply working her focus entirely on the task at hand. You didn't have to do this, he said. I'm not one for lying abed, she replied without turning around. And a man who works as hard as you do needs a hot breakfast. The biscuits she produced were light and fluffy, the bacon crisp, the eggs perfectly fried. They ate again, mostly in silence, but this time it felt different. It was the comfortable silence of two people starting a day of work. After the meal, she didn't wait for him. She began clearing the table and heating water for washing up with the same no-nonsense efficiency. Colton felt a strange sense of displacement in his own home. He was used to doing everything himself in his own time, in his own way. He stood feeling awkward. I'll be out with Gus, checking the north fences. All right, she said, her hands deep in the soapy water. Will you be back for a midday meal? We usually take something with us. There's leftover stew and biscuits. I can wrap them for you. Before he could answer, she had dried her hands and was packing a lunch for him and Gus in a clean cloth. She handed it to him. Her directness was disarming. He was accustomed to the simpering and indirectness of the women in town. Jenny was like a straight line in a world of confusing curves. Thank you, he mumbled, taking the bundle. He escaped to the barn, feeling like he'd been gently but firmly managed. Gus was already saddling Colton's horse, a big buckskin named Dust Devil. The old foreman shot him a knowing look, smelled coffee and bacon from the bunkhouse. Gus said, a small smile playing on his lips. A definite improvement. Colton just grunted and mounted up. As they rode out, he couldn't shake the image of Jenny at the stove, a solid, calming presence in the heart of his house. While they were gone, Jenny did not rest. After cleaning the kitchen until it shone, she explored her new domain. The house was clean but neglected. She found curtains neatly folded but unused in a trunk at the foot of her bed, and spent an hour hanging them, instantly softening the harsh light in the main room. She found his mending basket overflowing with socks that needed darning and shirts with missing buttons, and set to work with a thimble and thread. Then she went outside. She assessed the sad-looking vegetable patch near the house, choked with weeds. She found a hoe and a spade in the barn, and under the hot Montana sun began the back-breaking work of reclaiming it. She worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, her movements powerful and efficient. The few ranch hands who were around watched her from a distance, their curiosity piqued. They had heard the talk from town, but what they saw was a woman who worked as hard as any of them. When Colton and Gus returned at dusk, weary and covered in dust, the first thing Colton noticed were the curtains in the windows. The second was the smell of roasting chicken. The third, as he dismounted, was the sight of the transformed vegetable garden. A huge patch was cleared, the soil turned, and neat rows beginning to form. He stood there for a long moment, the reins loose in his hand, just staring. Jenny was sitting on the porch steps, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. There were smudges of dirt on her cheek, and her dress was stained with soil, but she didn't look tired. She looked satisfied. The soil is good, she said, her voice calm. Just needed a firm hand. Colton didn't know what to say. No woman he had ever known would have spent her first full day performing such grueling labor. He walked over and stood before her. You've done more work in a day than I've done on that garden in a year, he said, his voice filled with a genuine grudging awe. It needed doing, she replied simply, as if that explained everything. That evening, a new dynamic began to form. After supper, as Jenny took up his mending basket again, Colton found himself talking. He told her about the problem with the north fence line, how a few head of cattle had pushed through a weak spot near the creek. He wasn't trying to make conversation. He was simply thinking aloud, as he often did. Jenny didn't just listen. She asked questions. What kind of wood are the posts? Lodgepole pine. Are they set deep enough to handle the spring thaw when the ground gets soft? He found himself explaining the specifics of soil composition and fence construction to her, and she listened with an intelligent focus that surprised him. She understood the mechanics of it, the practical challenges. It was the most he had spoken to anyone other than Gus in years. A week later, they had to make a trip to Redemption Creek for supplies. Colton dreaded it. He had seen the way the town looked at her, and he felt a fierce protective instinct that was entirely new to him. Jenny, however, seemed unconcerned. She wore the same simple, clean dress, her expression as placid as a mountain lake. As Colton was loading sacks of flour and sugar into the wagon from Higgins's general store, Jenny was inside examining bolts of fabric. Beatrice Higgins and her cronies, Henrietta Price, and a mousy woman named Pearl were clustered near the counter, their whispers just loud enough to be heard. I declare she has the constitution of an ox, Beatrice said, snapping her fan shut. I hear she's been out digging in the dirt like a common labourer. Colton Harding must be desperate, Henrietta sneered, to bring that to his home. She's built like a barn door. Jenny, who was just a few feet away, didn't flinch. She continued to run a piece of blue calico through her fingers, her back to them. Colton, entering the store, heard the remark clearly. A cold fury seized him. He strode to the counter, his face a thundercloud. Mrs. Higgins, he said, his voice dangerously low. The women started their faces paling at his tone. I'll thank you to keep your opinions about my wife to yourself. If I hear another word, I'll take my business, and the business of every man who works for me, to the new mercantile over in Dawson Flats. It was a significant threat. The Diamond H was Beatrice's husband's biggest account. Her jaw dropped, and she stammered, Well, I was merely making an observation. Observe this, Colton said, his voice like chipping ice. The woman you're insulting has more character and integrity in her little finger than you and your friends possess in your entire bodies. Her name is Mrs. Harding now, and you will show her the respect that name commands. He threw a few coins on the counter for the fabric Jenny had chosen. Come, Jenny. He turned and stalked out of the store. Jenny placed the fabric on the counter, gave the three stunned women a long, unreadable look, and followed him. The ride back to the ranch started in a thick, charged silence. Colton's anger was a palpable thing. He was furious at the town, but also at himself for subjecting her to this. It was Jenny who finally broke the silence. The blue calico will make good curtains for the bedroom. He glanced at her. Her face was calm, her hands folded in her lap. Did you hear what they said? He asked, his voice tight. I'm not deaf, Colton, she said quietly. Their words are stones. They only hurt if you stand still long enough to let them hit you. I have been walking away from stones like that my whole life. He looked at her, then truly looked at her. He saw past the strong jaw and the broad shoulders. He saw the immense, quiet fortitude it must have taken to endure a lifetime of such casual cruelty without becoming bitter or broken. He saw a strength that was more than just physical. You shouldn't have to, he said, his voice filled with a raw emotion that surprised him. She turned her head and met his gaze. For the first time, he saw a genuine warmth in her eyes, a flicker of a smile at the corner of her lips. Perhaps, she said softly, but it was a fine thing to see someone stand and throw a few stones back for me. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them. The arrangement, the contract, the mail-order bargain fell away. He wasn't just her protector, he was her champion. And in his fierce, unexpected defense of her, she saw something beyond the silent, gruff rancher. She saw a man of deep, unshakable loyalty, a man of honor. As they rode on, the silence that returned was no longer awkward or heavy. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that was beginning to feel less like a partnership and more like a bond. The foundation had been laid, not with vows or promises, but with defended honor in a dusty general store and the mutual respect earned through hard work under the vast Montana sky. The incident at the general store sent ripples through Redemption Creek, but it did little to quell the underlying animosity. In fact, Colton's public defense of Jenny seemed only to galvanize his detractors, chief among them Lyle Drummond. Drummond was everything Colton was not. He owned the neighboring ranch, the Circle D, and was a man who favored tailored suits over buckskin charm over substance. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, and he had long coveted the Diamond H, not for its cattle but for its abundant water. The creek that was the lifeblood of Colton's ranch originated on land Drummond was trying to acquire, and he was using every tool at his disposal, legal and otherwise, to squeeze Colton out. Seeing Colton with a wife, a partner seemed to intensify Drummond's campaign. Drummond began to use Jenny as a weapon. He would see Colton in town and make loud, backhanded compliments. "Harding, good to see you. Heard your new wife is a real workhorse. Must save you a fortune in hired hands." He'd say it with a broad smile, the insult couched in supposed praise designed to humiliate. Colton's reaction was to withdraw even further, his public demeanor growing colder and more formidable. But at home, the opposite was happening. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble brick by silent brick under Jenny's steady influence. Their evenings fell into a comfortable routine. After supper, Colton would sit by the fire, cleaning a rifle or mending tack, and Jenny would sit in her chair, sewing or reading. But now they talked. She asked him about his parents, and he found himself telling her stories he hadn't thought of in years, about his father teaching him to track about his mother's laugh. In return, she spoke of Ohio, of the rhythms of a different kind of farm, of the quiet heartbreak, of watching the land her family had worked for generations wither and die. One evening a fierce autumn storm blew in the wind, howling like a banshee and rattling the window panes. A sudden violent crack of thunder spooked the horses in the near corral. A yearling filly, wild-eyed with panic, slammed against the gate, snapping the latch. Before Colton could even get his boots on, Jenny was out the door with a lantern, her shawl thrown over her head. He followed, watching in astonishment, as she waded into the rain and mud. The filly was rearing and bucking a danger to herself and the other horses. Jenny didn't shout or rush. She approached the panicked animal, slowly speaking in a low, calming monotone. "Easy now. Easy, girl. Just a little noise, that's all it is." She held the lantern low, not shining it in the horse's eyes. She moved with a liquid grace that belied her size, her presence powerful but not threatening. In minutes that felt like an eternity, she had calmed the filly enough to grab its halter and lead it back into the relative safety of the barn. Colton stood drenched in the doorway, watching her stroke the horse's neck. Her quiet murmurs the only sound besides the rain on the roof. When she finally turned to him, her hair had come loose from its bun and clung to her face in wet strands. In the flickering lantern light with the storm raging outside, he thought she had never looked more beautiful. "The latch on that gate is weak," she said, her voice practical as ever. "It'll need replacing with something stronger." He just nodded, unable to find his voice. This woman, mocked by the town for her lack of delicate femininity, possessed a courage and a deep instinctual wisdom that left him breathless. He saw not a draft horse or a barn door, but a woman of immense spirit and strength. The beauty he saw wasn't beneath the surface. It was the surface. It was in her capable hands, her steady gaze, her fearless heart. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, drying off the mood in the room, was charged with a new intimacy. "You're good with horses," he said, breaking the silence. "My father always said I had a feel for them," she replied, wringing water from the end of her long braid. "He said animals can sense a calm heart." She paused, then looked at him, her green eyes searching his. "Those people in town. Beatrice Higgins, Mr. Drummond. Why do you let them have so much space in your head?" He was taken aback by her directness. "I don't." "Yes, you do," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You let their poison make you hard. You build your walls higher. But a wall that keeps others out also cages you in." He looked away into the flames. "I was engaged once," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Before my father died. Her name was Annabelle. Her father was a banker back east. She came out for a visit, and she hated it. She said the ranch was crude, the town was backward, and I was unrefined." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "She went back east and married a man who owned a textile mill. I suppose I've been wary of refinement ever since." Jenny listened, her expression unreadable. When he was done, she said softly, "A woman who judges a man by the smoothness of his hands is a woman who will never know the satisfaction of building something real. She didn't deserve this." She gestured around the room at the solid house he had built. "And she didn't deserve you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the last of his defenses washed away. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only a profound and steady understanding. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her calloused, capable hand fit into his as if it were made to be there. "Jenny," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This started as a bargain, an arrangement. It's not that anymore. Not for me." A slow, shy smile touched her lips. "It hasn't been a bargain for me for a long time, Colton." The storm outside had passed, leaving the world clean and quiet. Inside the ranch house, the storm in Colton Harding's heart had finally broken as well. But as their bond deepened, the threat from outside grew more acute. Lyle Drummond, frustrated by Colton's refusal to be baited, escalated his tactics. Cattle from the Diamond H began to go missing a few at a time. A section of fence along the creek was deliberately cut, allowing a dozen head to wander onto Drummond's land, which he promptly and legally claimed as strays. Colton knew Drummond was behind it, but he had no proof. He set his ranch hands to patrol the borders, including a quiet, competent hand named Frank Miller. Frank had been with the Diamond H for 2 years and was a hard worker, always eager to please Colton. He was particularly vocal in his condemnation of Drummond. "That Drummond is a snake boss," Frank would say. "A low-down, claim-jumping snake. We ought to ride over there and teach him a lesson." Colton, however, was cautious. He wanted proof, not a range war. One afternoon, Gus O'Malley rode in his face grim. "Found this down by the creek where the fence was cut," he said, holding out a small, distinctive silver concho, the kind used to decorate fancy saddles. Colton took it. Drummond's men. Maybe Gus said his eyes narrowed. "But I saw Frank Miller admiring a new saddle just last week. A fancy one from a catalogue. Had conchos just like this on it. Seemed a mighty expensive piece of leather for a ranch hand's wages." Colton's gut tightened. "Frank, no. He's loyal. He hates Drummond as much as I do. Sometimes, the old foreman said wisely, the people who talk the loudest about hating a snake are the ones feeding it mice on the side. Colton didn't want to believe it. Frank was a good hand, but Gus's instincts were rarely wrong. The suggestion planted a seed of doubt, a cold dread that coiled in his stomach. The threat to his ranch, to the life he was building with Jenny, was not just coming from the outside. It might be coming from within his own gates. The betrayal, if true, would be a wound far deeper than any feud with Lyle Drummond. The first snows had come and gone, leaving the high peaks rimming the valley, stark white against the blue sky. A brittle, penetrating cold had settled in its place, and the tension on the Diamond H was a mirror of the weather. Colton felt it in the quiet moments, in the way Gus O'Malley would pause his whittling to watch the ranch hands. The foreman's warning about Frank Miller had taken root in Colton's mind, a seed of doubt that grew with every observation Frank's new boots too fine for his wages. His over-eager denunciations of Lyle Drummond, the furtive way he avoided Gus's steady gaze, the feeling that something was about to break, was inescapable. The break came on a bizarrely temperate night. A powerful Chinook wind howled down from the mountains, an unsettling warm breath that made the frigid air feel electric with nervous energy. Colton was on the porch watching the wind torment the bare trees when the world was torn apart. A deep, deafening roar ripped through the valley, a sound so violent it seemed to fracture the air itself. The ranch house shuddered, and a plate shattered in the kitchen. In the stunned silence that followed, a new sound began to build, the ominous, growing rumble of water unleashed. The headgate Colton breathed the words turning to ice in his chest. He met Jenny in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight, and saw his own horror reflected in her eyes. The herd, their wintering in the north pasture, the full, horrifying scope of the disaster, crashed down upon him. The north pasture sat in a low-lying bowl directly in the creek's path. The loss of the land would be a crippling blow, but the loss of hundreds of cattle to a flash flood. It would be the end of the Diamond H. It would be absolute ruin. As panic began to flare in the yard, ranch hands stumbling from the bunkhouse and shouting into the wind, Colton's mind reeled. But Jenny's cut through the chaos with a chilling clarity. While the men were shouting and running in circles, her face became a mask of intense focus. She looked past the immediate panic and saw the mechanics of the disaster, her practical mind already searching for a fulcrum. Colton, get the men. Try to turn the herd to high ground, she ordered, her voice sharp and clear above the rising din. She was already pulling on her boots, her movements swift and purposeful. As Colton and Gus began barking orders, rallying the frantic hands for a desperate ride to the pasture, Jenny didn't follow. She turned and ran, not toward the threatened herd, but toward the dark, cavernous opening of the workshop. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the familiar shapes of tools and equipment. She had spent countless hours in here, absorbing the purpose of every chain and gear. Her gaze landed on a massive block and tackle system, coiled like a metal serpent in the corner. An idea born of desperation and audacious ingenuity slammed into her. The main channel of the creek, she knew, from her explorations, narrowed significantly about a quarter-mile downstream, flowing between two solid rocky outcrops. If she could somehow obstruct that channel, she could force the bulk of the floodwaters into an old dry wash that led harmlessly away from the pasture. She burst back out into the chaotic yard. "Gus!" She bellowed, her powerful alto voice cutting through the wind. "I need your 2 strongest men and a team of draft horses. Now trust me." Gus, who was about to mount his horse, turned to stare at her. He saw the wild, fierce determination in her eyes, the utter certainty on her face, and made a split-second decision. He trusted his gut about Frank Miller. He would trust it now about Colton's wife. He nodded curtly. "Pete, Charlie." "You heard her!" He yelled to two of the burliest hands. "Get the Clydesdales hitched to the big wagon." Jenny was already directing them, her voice a clarion call of command. "The heavy block and tackle. All the chain you can find. Every coil of heavy rope." While Colton and the rest of his men were riding furiously into the windy darkness on a near-hopeless mission, Jenny led her small crew on a frantic, bone-jarring ride along the creek bank. The ground was quickly turning to treacherous mud as the floodwater seeped across it. The roar ahead was deafening, a constant reminder of the force they were about to confront. There she shouted, pointing. Ahead of them, at the narrowest point of the channel, stood a colossal dead cottonwood tree, a giant left over from another era. Its roots on the creek side were already partially undercut by years of normal flow. "That's our dam. We're going to pull that tree into the channel." Pete and Charlie looked from the raging water to the massive tree, then back to Jenny, their faces pale with disbelief. The task seemed impossible. "There is no time to argue," Jenny commanded, leaping from the still-moving wagon with a grace that defied her stature. She was already wrestling with a thick coil of chain, her expression a mask of pure, unyielding will. "Pete, get the team-positioned Charlie with me." Her certainty was a magnetic force. Shaking off their doubt, the men scrambled to obey. Jenny worked alongside them, her own considerable strength, a vital asset. She waded into the leading edge of the flood, the freezing water swirling around her boots, and directed the wrapping of the chains around the base of the massive trunk. She shouted instructions over the roar, her mind a whirlwind of angles and forces, directing the men to anchor the block and tackle system to a solid rock formation on the opposite bank. She was not just working, she was engineering a miracle. Miles away in the heart of the North Pasture, Colton was fighting a desperate losing battle. The front wall of the flood, a churning wave of mud and debris, was tearing through the low-lying areas. The cattle, mad with terror, scattered in every direction. It was like trying to stop the tide with a teacup. As he galloped along the edge of the torrent, his heart sinking with the certainty of his ruin, a movement on the far ridge caught his eye. A lone rider, silhouetted for a fleeting moment against the moonlit, wind-scoured clouds, before dipping down out of sight. The rider was moving fast, heading away from the disaster, back toward the lights of the Drummond Ranch. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the powerful sorrel that Frank Miller was so proud of. Gus's warning slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Frank. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The new boots, the feigned hatred of Drummond. It was all a lie. At that exact moment, a flicker of lantern light from the direction of the Narrows caught his eye, a tiny beacon of human effort against the overwhelming chaos of nature. Hope, desperate and illogical, warred with his despair. He wrenched Dust Devil's reins, turning the powerful buckskin away from the doomed herd and spurring him toward the light. He arrived at the Narrows to a scene of almost biblical struggle. His two draft horses, their muscles straining, were digging their hooves into the muddy bank. The ropes and chains of the tackle system were stretched taut as harp strings humming with incredible tension. And at the center of it all was Jenny. Soaked to the bone, her hair ripped free of its bun and whipping around her face like a wild pennant. She was shouting encouragement to the horses and men, her entire body braced as if she herself were part of the machine. "Pull, pull now," she roared. The colossal cottonwood groaned a sound like a dying giant. It resisted its deep roots, clinging to the earth. Then, with a series of sharp cracks that sounded like rifle shots, the roots began to tear free. The massive tree shuddered, leaned, and with a final drawn-out scream of tortured wood it fell. It crashed into the Narrows with a thunderous impact, sending a wave of water surging into the sky. It wasn't a perfect dam, but it was enough. The main force of the flood was deflected, pouring into the dry wash. The water level in the pasture was checked. The bulk of the herd would be saved. Colton slid from his horse, his mind unable to fully process what he was seeing. He looked at Pete and Charlie, their faces slack with a mixture of utter exhaustion and profound awe. And then he looked at his wife. Jenny stood knee-deep in the swirling, redirected water, her hands on her hips, her chest heaving as she surveyed her handiwork. She had not just confronted a disaster, she had bent it to her will. He stumbled forward, wading into the cold water, until he reached her. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, oblivious to the mud, the cold, the chaos. Jenny was all he could manage, the name, a ragged prayer torn from his throat. She leaned her full weight against him, her own formidable strength, finally giving way to trembling exhaustion. The herd, she whispered. Are they safe? He held her tighter, burying his face in her wet hair. You saved them, he said, his voice thick with a storm of relief, love, and overwhelming admiration. You saved everything. The next morning, under a clear, cold sky, the full scope of the treachery was laid bare. With Gus at his side, Colton walked into the bunkhouse. Frank Miller was sitting on his bunk, trying to project an air of normalcy that failed miserably. Terrible business last night, boss, Frank, began, his voice a little too loud. That Drummond, he's finally Colton, cut him off. He reached into his pocket and threw the small silver concho onto the blanket at Frank's feet. It landed with a softer, damning thud. Frank's face, when he saw it, crumbled. All the bluster, all the feigned indignation evaporated, leaving behind the weak, craven man he truly was. He confessed everything, the words tumbling out in a pathetic stream, Drummond Silver, his own festering jealousy, the dynamite. A rage so cold and pure it burned, filled Colton's veins. But as he looked at the pathetic, trembling man before him, he felt a profound weariness settle over him. Pack your things? Colton said, his voice deadly quiet, more terrifying than any shout. I am giving you 10 minutes to be off my land. If I ever see your face in this valley again, Gus will not be here to hold me back. Get out. Frank scrambled to obey and fled the ranch without a backward glance. But Colton's business was far from over. He strode to the barn and saddled Dust Devil, his movements precise and deliberate. Jenny met him as he led the horse out her own mount, already saddled beside it. She had a small leather-bound book in her hand. Her expression was as determined as his. They would face the true snake together. They rode to the Circle D not as aggressors, but as arbiters of a final judgment. They found Lyle Drummond on his wide porch, sipping coffee from a china cup, the very picture of a man without a care in the world. Harding Drummond called out a smug, predatory smile spreading across his face. I heard you had a spot of trouble last night. A terrible shame about that creek of yours. The creek is fine, Drummond Colton said, swinging down from his horse. Jenny dismounted and came to stand at his shoulder, a silent, formidable presence. And your man, Frank Miller, was very talkative this morning. Drummond's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The word of a disgraced, fired ranch hand. That's a liar's word against a gentleman's. It's more than that, Jenny said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through Drummond's arrogance. She stepped forward, holding up the leather-bound ledger. This is the supply ledger from your East Pasture camp. Frank was so certain of our ruin he left it behind in his haste. It details in your own handwriting the dates and amounts of dynamite you signed out to him over the last month. Far more than a man would ever need for clearing rocks. Wouldn't you agree, Drummond stared at the ledger, his face draining of all color. The smugness, the charm, the predatory confidence, it all dissolved, leaving behind the pale, panicked face of a cheat who had been caught. "You are finished in this valley," Drummond Colton stated, his voice ringing with the cold finality of a death knell. "The territorial marshal in Helena is a friend of my father's. I am presenting him with this ledger and my testimony. You can sell your land to me for a fair price, or you can try to sell it from a prison cell. The choice is yours." Drummond looked from Colton's unyielding face to Jenny's steady, unwavering gaze. He saw no weakness to exploit. He saw only an unbreakable union, a fortress of two. He was utterly, completely defeated. Word of Drummond's crimes and Jenny's heroism spread through Redemption Creek like a Chinook wind. The story of her pulling the tree into the raging creek became legend. The cruel whispers about the Harding draft horse died out, replaced by murmurs of respect and unconcealed awe. When Colton and Jenny rode into town, men tipped their hats. Beatrice Higgins, her face a mask of bitter humiliation, scurried into her husband's store to avoid their gaze. One crisp, sunny afternoon, weeks later, Colton and Jenny stood on the porch of the ranch house. The creek flowed peacefully. The cattle grazed in the saved pasture. The house behind them felt warm, filled with the comforting smell of baking bread and the sight of her new blue curtains fluttering in the breeze. It was no longer just a house. It was indisputably a home. Colton turned and put his arms around his wife. He looked down at her strong, handsome profile, at the quiet strength in her moss-green eyes, and felt a love so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. "They all looked for beauty in a china doll," he said softly, his voice full of wonder. "Fools. They never understood. The grandest beauty is in the mountain that shelters you from the storm." Jenny leaned back into his embrace, a true radiant smile lighting up her entire face. "And the strongest shelter," she replied, her voice rich with a love as deep and solid as his own, "is the home you build with a man of honor." They stood together, two powerful, resilient souls who had found in each other not what the world told them to expect, but everything they would ever need. In the vast, untamed heart of the West, they had forged a life and a love that was as real, as strong, and as enduring as the land itself. In the end, it was never about Jenny's size, but about the scale of her spirit. Colton Harding didn't just see the beauty beneath it all. He recognized that her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering heart were the beauty. Their story reminds us that true partnerships aren't built on shallow first impressions or the cruel whispers of a crowd, but on shared struggle, mutual respect, and a love that is strong enough to move mountains, or in this case, a cottonwood tree. They transformed a lonely ranch into a thriving home and turned a contract of convenience into a legendary love story, proving that the most beautiful souls are often found in the most unassuming packages. If the story of Jenny and Colton's resilience and love touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the untamed American West, where character is the only currency that truly matters.